It was supposed to be a peaceful hike, a relaxing escape from the bustle of everyday life. I had been planning this for weeks, a solitary walk through the dense forest just outside town. I had my backpack, a good pair of boots, plenty of water, and enough snacks to keep me going for a few days if I needed to. The sun was shining when I started, and the air smelled fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. The trails here were known for their beauty and tranquility, and I had hiked here many times before, though never by myself. But today I was craving the solitude. I set off early in the morning, the cool breeze making the trees sway gently above me. The sound of birds singing in the distance was soothing, and I could hear the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. The trail was familiar, winding through the forest, and I knew it well. My goal was to reach the old creek that ran through the woods, a spot I had always enjoyed. It wasn't far, just a couple of miles, but I hadn't realized how quickly things would take a turn. I took my time, enjoying the peacefulness, breathing in the crisp air, and keeping my pace slow. The trail was clear, marked by well-worn signs and arrows, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I followed the path, lost in my thoughts, when I realized I hadn't seen the familiar signposts for a while. The trail seemed to have changed, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what was wrong. I checked my map, realizing I had strayed a little off course. No big deal, I thought. The woods weren't all that vast here. I could always turn back and retrace my steps. But as I turned around, I noticed that the path behind me was no longer visible. It was as if the woods had closed in on themselves, swallowing the trail behind me. I stopped in my tracks, my heart rate picking up. This wasn't right. I had been following the same trail for years, but now it was gone. The trees around me seemed unfamiliar. The ground beneath my boots felt different. A knot formed in my stomach. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. I decided to keep walking, thinking that if I just pressed on, I'd find something familiar. The forest felt eerily still, the birds' songs quieting as I moved deeper. Every crack of a twig underfoot sounded louder, more unsettling. I kept my head down, focusing on the next step, but it didn't feel like I was getting anywhere. The trees seemed to grow taller, the underbrush thicker. The further I went, the more disorienting everything became. After what felt like hours, I realized I had no idea where I was anymore. I looked around, the landscape shifting in ways I didn't remember. The trees were so dense now, it felt like the entire forest had closed in around me. The sky above was barely visible through the thick canopy of leaves. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked the same. I was lost, completely, hopelessly lost. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that I had hiked in forests before, that I could survive this. I pulled out my map again, but it didn't help. I knew where I had started, but the woods had shifted around me. There was no telling where I was now. I continued walking, hoping for a sign of a clearing or something familiar, but nothing came. My water supply was getting low, and the snacks in my backpack weren't going to last long. I had no choice but to keep moving. I pushed through the brush, trying to find the edge of the woods or a trail marker, but the more I walked, the more it felt like the forest was closing in on me. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and I knew night would come soon. The thought of being alone in the woods after dark made my heart race. I needed to find shelter. I needed to find my way out. As the light faded, the forest became darker, the shadows stretching across the ground like fingers reaching for me. The temperature dropped rapidly, and I shivered, not just from the cold, but from the growing sense of dread that settled in my chest. The woods were no longer quiet. I could hear distant sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. It was as if something was following me, watching me. I found a small, natural hollow between two large trees and decided to rest for a moment. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and pulled out the last of my water. The stillness of the night was suffocating, and the darkness pressed in around me like a heavy weight. I knew I needed to keep moving, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the small bit of shelter I had found. The sounds of the forest seemed louder now, more menacing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. It was just me in these woods, wasn't it? I kept telling myself that, but the noises wouldn't stop. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs. And then, a branch cracked loudly behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, the darkness. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I stood up, grabbing my backpack, and decided to move on. But then, I heard something, a low, guttural growl, like an animal, but deeper, more unsettling. It was distant, but it was there, just enough to make my blood run cold. I froze, not daring to breathe. The sound echoed in the night, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I backed away slowly, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The growl came again, closer this time. I turned and bolted, not knowing which direction I was running in, just desperate to get away. My boots pounded against the ground, the brush scratching at my legs, but I didn't stop. The growling continued, following me, growing louder. My heart was racing, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I couldn't afford to stop. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into a small clearing. It wasn't much, but it was open, and the trees were spaced farther apart. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, listening for any sign of what was chasing me. The growling had stopped, but I could still hear movement in the distance. Something was out there. I knew I had to keep moving. I couldn't let whatever it was find me. My mind was spinning, and I couldn't think straight, but I had no choice. I had to survive. I forced myself to my feet and began walking again, not caring about the direction, just trying to put distance between me and the noise. The night was unnaturally quiet now, the only sound being the crunch of leaves underfoot. I stumbled, my legs aching, but I pushed on. The fear had a grip on me now, and I couldn't let it control me. I had to stay focused. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it, a faint light through the trees. It was distant, but it was there. I had to get to it. I pushed myself harder, running as fast as I could through the woods, ignoring the pain in my legs, the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm me. Couldn't stop, couldn't give up. The light grew brighter as I drew closer, and soon I could make out the shape of a cabin in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, a chance to survive. I stumbled toward the cabin, and as I neared, the door creaked open. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by the light inside. They didn't say anything, but their eyes met mine, and in that moment, I knew I had found safety. I had made it out of the woods alive. I collapsed inside, breathing heavily, my heart still pounding. The figure didn't ask questions, didn't need to. They handed me a warm drink and a blanket. I was safe. I was out of the woods. I grew up loving the outdoors. There was something about being surrounded by trees and the sound of birds that made me feel alive. So, when I had a long weekend coming up, I decided to go for a solo hiking trip. It wasn't my first time hiking alone, and I felt confident. I picked a remote trail in the mountains, one that promised stunning views and the kind of solitude I craved. I packed everything I thought I'd need: food, water, a map, a compass, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. I even brought a small tent and a sleeping bag just in case. The drive to the trailhead took a couple of hours, and by the time I got there, it was mid-morning. The weather was perfect: clear skies, a gentle breeze, and just warm enough to be comfortable. I checked my gear one last time and set off. The first few hours of hiking were incredible. The trail wound through dense forest, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking views of the valleys below. I stopped for lunch near a small stream, feeling completely at peace. After lunch, I decided to explore a little off the main trail. I'd read online about a hidden lake that wasn't marked on most maps. The idea of finding it felt like a mini adventure within my trip. I had a general idea of where it was supposed to be, and with my map and compass, I figured I'd be fine. At first, the detour seemed like a great idea. The forest off the trail was even more beautiful, untouched and wild. I felt like I was stepping into a different world. But as the hours passed, I started to realize I might have underestimated how far the lake was. The terrain was tougher than I expected, with steep inclines and thick underbrush. I told myself I'd just go a little further and turn back if I didn't find it. It was around late afternoon when I finally admitted to myself that I wasn't going to find the lake. I decided it was time to head back. But when I turned around and started retracing my steps, nothing looked familiar. The trees all seemed the same, and the landmarks I thought I'd remember were nowhere to be seen. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I had a compass and a map. I just need to figure out my location and find my way back to the main trail. But the more I tried to navigate, the more lost I felt. The forest seemed to close in around me, and the light was starting to fade. Panic began to creep in, but I pushed it down. I told myself to focus. I found a relatively clear spot, sat down, and pulled out my map and compass. I knew the general direction of the trailhead, so I decided to head that way. As long as I kept moving, I'd find something familiar, right? The problem was the forest wasn't making it easy. The underbrush was thick, and the ground was uneven. Every step felt like a struggle. I'd go a few hundred feet and then have to adjust my direction to avoid a dense patch of trees or a steep drop. And with the sun setting, it was getting harder to see. I pulled out my flashlight, but the beam felt weak against the vast darkness of the forest. I hadn't realized how quickly the night would fall out here. By the time it was fully dark, I knew I wasn't going to make it back to the trailhead that night. I needed to find a place to camp. I found a relatively flat spot and set up my tent. I wasn't hungry, but I forced myself to eat a protein bar. I knew I needed the energy. The night was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Every little sound made me jump. I tried to sleep, but my mind was racing. What if I couldn't find my way back tomorrow? What if something happened to me out here? Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as it was light, I packed up and started moving. I was determined to stay calm and focused. I decided to follow a small stream I'd come across the day before. Streams often lead to larger bodies of water or even trails, I told myself. But as the hours dragged on, I started to doubt that decision. The stream twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the forest. My legs were aching, and my water supply was running low. I tried not to think about what would happen if I ran out completely. Around midday, I stumbled upon an old, overgrown trail. It wasn't marked on my map, but it was something. I decided to follow it, hoping it would lead me to a main trail or at least a recognizable landmark. The trail was faint, barely more than a suggestion in the underbrush, but it gave me a sense of direction. I followed it for what felt like hours, the sun beating down through the gaps in the trees. My body was exhausted, but I kept pushing forward. Then I heard it, the faint sound of rushing water. My heart leapt. Water meant a stream or a river, and rivers often led to people. I followed the sound, my pace quickening despite my fatigue. When I finally reached the source, I was both relieved and disappointed. It was a river, but it was wide and fast-moving with no easy way to cross. Still, it was a lifeline. I decided to follow it downstream, hoping it would lead me to a bridge or a crossing point. The next few hours were a blur of walking and stumbling. I was running on pure adrenaline, my body screaming for rest. The forest on either side of the river was dense, making it hard to stay close to the water. I had to keep moving, though. Stopping felt like giving up. As the sun began to set, I spotted something that made my heart skip a beat. A cabin. It was small and weathered, tucked away in the trees. I almost couldn't believe it was real. I approached cautiously, calling out as I got closer. There was no response, but the door was unlocked. Inside, it was clear the cabin hadn't been used in years. There was dust everywhere, and the furniture was old and worn. But it was shelter. I found a small stash of canned food in one of the cupboards, along with an old metal pot. There was a fireplace, and after some effort, I managed to get a fire going. For the first time in 2 days, I felt a flicker of hope. That night, I slept better than I thought I would. The cabin felt like a shield against the vast, uncaring forest. In the morning, I decided to stay put for a while. I needed to conserve my energy and figure out my next move. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin, looking for signs of a trail or road. I also collected as much firewood as I could find, knowing I'd need it if I had to stay another night. On the third day, I decided to follow the river again. I left a note in the cabin, just in case someone came by, and packed the rest of the canned food. By now, my body was running on fumes, but I pushed through. Hours later, I came across a dirt road. It was overgrown, but it was a road. I followed it, praying it would lead me somewhere. By evening, I saw the unmistakable shape of a car in the distance. It was parked near a small clearing where the road met a wider trail. I almost cried with relief. I waited near the car until its owner returned, a hunter who looked as surprised to see me as I was relieved to see him. He gave me water and offered to drive me back to town. When I finally got back to civilization, the relief was overwhelming. I learned a lot during those 3 days in the forest, about the wilderness, about preparation, and about myself. I still love hiking, but I've never underestimated the forest again. It was supposed to be a short hike, just a couple of hours to clear my head. I'd been working nonstop for weeks, and my mind felt fried from staring at computer screens. The idea of fresh air, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the scent of pine needles seemed like the perfect remedy. I chose a trail I'd seen listed online, one of those lesser-known ones, tucked away on the edge of a national forest. It wasn't far from town, and according to the reviews, it was quiet and peaceful. Just what I needed. I parked my car in the gravel lot, the only vehicle there. It was a chilly morning, the kind that made your breath visible in the air. I double-checked my gear, water bottle, a protein bar, and my phone. I had a map downloaded just in case I lost service. The trail was marked as an easy loop, about 5 miles long, so I didn't see the need to pack more than the basics. I slipped on my backpack and set off. The trailhead was well marked, with a wooden sign detailing the route and some warnings about local wildlife. Bears were the main concern, but I'd brought bear spray just in case. The first part of the trail was easy, a well-trodden dirt path weaving through a mix of deciduous and evergreen trees. Birds chirped overhead, and the sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the ground. It felt good to be out here, away from the noise of the city and the constant hum of emails and notifications. About an hour in, the trail started to climb. It wasn't steep, but it was enough to get my heart rate up. The views opened up as I ascended, revealing rolling hills covered in dense forest. I stopped to take a sip of water and snap a photo. The trail was still easy to follow, marked with small wooden signs every so often. I hadn't seen another soul since I started, which was both a little eerie and exactly what I'd been hoping for. As I continued, the path narrowed. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a tight arch overhead. The undergrowth thickened, and I had to step carefully to avoid tripping on roots and rocks. I noticed fewer trail markers, but I wasn't too concerned. The map showed the loop clearly, and I hadn't taken any turns. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest felt denser here, the air cooler. The chirping birds had gone silent, replaced by an unsettling quiet that made me hyper-aware of every crunch of my boots. After another half hour, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. I stopped, pulling out my phone to check the map. The GPS dot hovered uncertainly, struggling to pinpoint my location. I cursed under my breath and looked around. The trail had become faint, barely more than a thin line of dirt cutting through the brush. I decided to backtrack, figuring I'd missed a marker or a turn somewhere along the way, but retracing my steps didn't help. The landscape looked unfamiliar, the trees blending into one another in a confusing sameness. Panic started to creep in as I realized I might be lost. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I had the map, I had water, and I wasn't too far from the starting point. I'd be fine. I turned back in what I thought was the direction of the trailhead, keeping an eye out for anything recognizable. The sun, now high overhead, didn't help much with navigation. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, a maze of trunks and shadows. My phone's GPS was still useless, and I had no signal to call for help. Hours passed. My legs ached from walking, and my water bottle was almost empty. I'd eaten the protein bar earlier, but it had barely taken the edge off my growing hunger. I'd started marking trees with scratches from a small pocket knife, trying to avoid going in circles. The marks gave me a strange sense of comfort, a way to track my progress, even if I wasn't sure where I was going. As the afternoon wore on, the light began to change. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that made the forest feel even more alien. I stumbled upon a small stream and knelt to refill my water bottle, using a portable filter I'd almost forgotten I had. The cold water was a relief, but it did little to ease my growing anxiety. I had no idea how far I'd wandered or how to get back to the car. By the time dusk settled in, I knew I had to stop and make camp. Walking in the dark was a bad idea, especially without a clear path. I found a relatively flat spot near the stream and gathered some fallen branches to build a small fire. It wasn't much, just enough to keep me warm and provide a bit of light. I sat close to the flames, wrapping my arms around my knees. The forest seemed alive at night, filled with the rustling of unseen creatures and the occasional hoot of an owl. Every noise set my nerves on edge. Sleep was impossible. I'd doze off for a few minutes, only to jerk awake at some sound or the cold seeping through my clothes. The hours dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt a surge of relief. I extinguished the fire, making sure the embers were cold, and set off again. The second day was worse. My legs felt like lead, and my stomach ached with hunger. I'd hoped to find the trail or some sign of civilization, but the forest seemed determined to keep me lost. The marks I'd made on the trees were no longer visible, and I'd stopped trying to use the map. It was useless without a clear point of reference. Around midday, I stumbled upon an old, overgrown logging road. My heart leapt. It wasn't the trail, but it was something, a man-made path that had to lead somewhere. I followed it, my pace quickening despite my exhaustion. The road twisted and turned, overgrown with weeds and partially blocked by fallen trees. It was slow going, but it gave me hope. By late afternoon, the road led me to a clearing. In the center stood a small, dilapidated cabin. The roof sagged, and the windows were broken, but it was a shelter. I approached cautiously, peering inside. The interior was empty, save for some broken furniture and a rusted wood stove. It wasn't much, but it felt like a lifeline. I spent the night in the cabin, thankful for the walls and roof. I found an old tin can near the stove and used it to boil water from the stream, hoping it would stave off any bacteria. The firelight flickered on the walls, and for the first time since getting lost, I felt a tiny spark of hope. If there was a cabin, there had to be people nearby. Logging roads didn't exist in isolation. The next morning, I set out again, following the road further. It was slow progress, but I felt a sense of purpose. The road eventually led to a fork, and I chose the path that seemed more traveled. Hours later, just as the sun was starting to set, I heard it, the distant hum of a car engine. I practically ran toward the sound, emerging onto a paved road where a pickup truck was parked on the shoulder. The driver, a middle-aged man in a flannel shirt, looked startled as I waved him down. He gave me water and a granola bar while I explained what had happened. He offered to drive me back to town, and I accepted without hesitation. As we drove, the reality of what I'd been through started to sink in. I'd spent 2 nights lost in the woods, surviving on sheer determination and a bit of luck. When we reached the small town near the trailhead, I thanked the man profusely. He refused any payment, just glad to help. I retrieved my car from the lot, its sight almost bringing me to tears. As I sat behind the wheel, the weight of the ordeal finally lifted. I'd made it out. I was safe, and I'd never take a simple hike for granted again. The air smelled of pine and damp earth as I parked my car at the trailhead. It was late afternoon, and the light was already beginning to soften, casting long shadows across the gravel lot. I shouldered my backpack, double-checked my gear, and set off down the trail. This was supposed to be a solo weekend trip, a chance to disconnect from the world and reconnect with myself. I'd picked a spot deep in the woods, a small clearing near a creek that I'd found on a map but never visited before. The trail started out easy, weaving through tall trees and thick undergrowth. Birds chirped overhead, and every now and then, I'd hear the rustle of leaves as a squirrel darted through the brush. I felt a sense of calm as my boots crunched against the dirt path. There's something grounding about being out in nature, away from the constant buzz of phones and emails. As the sun dipped lower, the trail became more rugged. Roots jutted out like claws, and the path narrowed until I was brushing against ferns and brambles. I checked my map to make sure I was still on course. According to the marked route, I should have been close to the clearing. But as I walked, the forest seemed to grow denser. The trees loomed larger, their branches intertwining overhead and blocking out much of the remaining daylight. I felt a slight unease but shrugged it off. I probably just misjudged the distance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I broke through the thicket and found the clearing. It was smaller than I'd expected, but it would do. A creek gurgled nearby, its sound soothing against the quiet of the forest. I set down my pack, took a swig of water, and began setting up camp. The tent went up easily, and I gathered some dry wood for a fire. By the time I had everything ready, the sun had slipped below the horizon, and the woods were cloaked in shadows. I lit the fire and sat back, letting its warmth seep into my skin. The night was cool, and the stars were starting to peek through the canopy above. I ate a simple dinner of trail mix and jerky, washing it down with water from my flask. It was peaceful, just me and the crackling fire. But as the night deepened, that earlier unease crept back in. The woods felt too quiet. The usual nighttime chorus of insects and distant animal calls was strangely absent. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the cool temperature had silenced the crickets, or maybe I was just imagining things. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the tree line, but it was impossible to see beyond the flickering light of the fire. Shadows danced and shifted, but nothing moved. I forced myself to relax, reminding myself that I was alone out here, probably just tired from the hike. I thought, After dousing the fire, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. The thin walls felt both comforting and vulnerable. I lay there for a while, listening to the creak and the occasional rustle of leaves. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept playing tricks on me, imagining shapes in the darkness and phantom footsteps outside the tent. But eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. The forest was pitch black, and the only sound was the gentle flow of the creek. I lay still, my heart pounding, straining to hear anything unusual. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic crunching. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving through the undergrowth near my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed completely still, my mind racing. Could it be a deer? A bear? But the steps didn't have the heavy, uneven quality of an animal. They sounded human. I reached for my knife, the only weapon I'd brought, and held it tightly in my hand. The footsteps circled the tent, pausing every so often, as if whoever or whatever it was listening. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, the footsteps faded into the distance. I lay there, gripping the knife, too scared to move. Sleep was out of the question. I stayed awake, listening for any sign of the intruder, but the night remained silent. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent cautiously and stepped outside. The clearing looked the same as it had the evening before, but I felt exposed in the daylight. I scanned the ground for any signs of who or what had been there. Near the edge of the clearing, I found them. Footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked there. The sight sent a chill down my spine. I debated packing up and leaving right then, but I'd planned for 2 nights, and I didn't want to let fear ruin my trip. I convinced myself that it could have been another hiker who'd wandered too close, maybe even curious about my camp. It wasn't a comforting thought, but it was better than some alternatives. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. The day passed uneventfully. I hiked to a nearby overlook, took some photos, and tried to enjoy the solitude. But the forest felt different now, less inviting. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set me on edge. By the time I returned to camp, I'd made up my mind to leave the next morning. One more night, I told myself. Just get through one more night. That evening, I built the fire higher than the night before, its flames casting a wider circle of light. I kept my knife close and didn't stray far from the fire. As the hours dragged on, I started to feel foolish for being so paranoid. Maybe I'd imagined the footsteps, or maybe they'd been a harmless passerby. But just as I was beginning to relax, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they came from the opposite side of the clearing. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. My heart raced as I stood, knife in hand, peering into the darkness. The firelight didn't reach far enough to see who or what was out there. "Hello," I called, though my voice trembled. There was no response. The footsteps stopped, and the silence was deafening. I felt trapped, like a cornered animal, my mind racing through scenarios. Should I run? Stay by the fire? Confront whoever was out there? Before I could decide, a loud crash came from the trees, as if something heavy had been thrown. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I chose flight. Grabbing my pack and leaving the tent behind, I bolted down the trail, the firelight fading quickly behind me. I didn't look back, too afraid of what I might see. The hike back to the car was a blur. The trail, which had seemed so serene before, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and threats. Every noise made me jump, and I constantly glanced over my shoulder. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, relief washed over me. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. It wasn't until I was miles away that I allowed myself to breathe normally again. I never found out who or what had been out there. Maybe it was just another camper, or maybe it was someone with less innocent intentions. All I know is that I've never felt truly alone in the woods since that night. Even now, the thought of those footsteps circling my tent makes my skin crawl. I still love hiking and camping, but I've never gone solo again. The forest felt endless as I trudged deeper into the woods, my backpack heavy on my shoulders. It was late October, and the crisp air carried a faint scent of decaying leaves. I had planned this solo camping trip for months, eager to escape the monotony of daily life. My job had been grinding me down, and I craved the peace and solitude of nature. Armed with a detailed map and enough supplies for 3 days, I felt confident I could handle whatever the wilderness threw at me. I arrived at the trailhead around mid-morning. The sun filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I had chosen a less popular route, hoping to avoid other hikers. After all, solitude was the goal. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, but it was well marked, and I felt at ease as I followed it. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at small animals going about their day. It felt good to be out here, away from the constant hum of city life. By late afternoon, I had covered about 10 miles. My legs were sore, but it was a satisfying kind of ache. I found a clearing near a small creek and decided to set up camp. The spot was perfect. Level ground, access to water, and surrounded by tall pines that shielded me from the wind. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and cooked a simple meal of instant noodles and jerky. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped sharply. I wrapped myself in my jacket and sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke up early, eager to explore the area. My plan was to hike to a nearby ridge that offered stunning views of the valley below. The trail leading to the ridge was steeper and rockier than I had anticipated, but the effort was worth it. When I reached the top, the view took my breath away. The valley stretched out below me, a patchwork of orange and yellow foliage, with the creek snaking through the center like a silver ribbon. I sat there for a long time, soaking in the beauty and the silence. On the way back to camp, I noticed something odd. A set of footprints, fresh ones, cut across the trail. They were larger than mine and appeared to be heading in the same direction I had come from. I hadn't seen anyone all day, and the realization unsettled me. I tried to shake it off, reasoning that someone could have taken a different trail and looped back. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. When I returned to my campsite, everything was as I had left it. My tent was intact, and my supplies were untouched. The fire pit still held the cold ashes from the previous night. I forced myself to relax, telling myself I was being paranoid. After all, this was a public forest. It wasn't unusual for others to be out here. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard a sound that made my heart skip a beat. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the natural sounds of the forest. But as I strained to listen, it became clearer. The crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. They were slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, my hand gripping the handle of my cooking pot. My mind raced through the possibilities. A deer? A bear? Or was it the person who had left those footprints? "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, and every nerve in my body was on edge. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of retreating footsteps, fading into the distance. I stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness, before finally convincing myself to finish my meal. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my tent, listening to every creak and rustle outside. The wind picked up, and the trees swayed, their branches groaning like old wooden beams. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach churn. Just outside my campsite, on a patch of bare earth, was a fresh footprint. It was large, with deep impressions that suggested whoever had left it was heavy. The print was pointed directly at my tent. My pulse quickened as I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, deciding to cut my trip short. The idea of spending another night out here didn't sit well with me anymore. I decided to take a different route back to the trailhead, one that would loop around the ridge and add a few extra miles to my hike. I hoped it would also increase my chances of encountering other hikers. The trail was rougher and less maintained, but I didn't care. I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and whoever had been near my campsite. As the day wore on, the sense of unease grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves made me whip around, my heart pounding. I started noticing little things that didn't seem right. A pile of stones arranged in a neat stack by the side of the trail, a tree with its bark gouged out in long, parallel lines, and once, a faint whiff of cigarette smoke carried on the wind. It felt as though the forest itself was conspiring against me. By late afternoon, I was utterly drained. My legs felt like lead, and my water supply was running low. I knew I needed to find a place to rest, but the thought of stopping made my skin crawl. Finally, I came across a rocky outcrop that offered a decent vantage point. I sat down, my back against the cool stone, and tried to catch my breath. The forest stretched out before me, serene and indifferent. For a moment, I almost felt foolish for letting my imagination get the better of me. And then I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the trees, partially obscured by the shadows. He was tall, wearing dark clothing, and he wasn't moving. My breath caught in my throat as I realized he was looking directly at me. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, nearly losing my balance. When I looked back, he was gone. I didn't think. I just ran. The trail blurred beneath my feet as adrenaline propelled me forward. I didn't care about the noise I was making or the risk of tripping. All I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between myself and that man. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. When I finally stumbled onto a wider, more well-used trail, I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. The sun was setting, and the shadows were growing longer. I forced myself to get up and keep moving, following the trail as it wound downhill. Eventually, I saw a signpost that pointed the way to the trailhead. Relief washed over me, and I quickened my pace. I reached the parking lot just as darkness fell. My car was the only one there. I threw my backpack into the trunk and got behind the wheel, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the lot, but when I looked again, there was nothing. The drive home was a blur. When I finally walked through my front door, I felt a wave of relief so intense it brought tears to my eyes. I locked every door and window in the house, double-checked them, and then checked again. That night, I slept with the lights on. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind. Who was that man? What did he want? And why had he been out there in the middle of nowhere? I'll probably never know the answers. But one thing is certain. I won't be going back into the woods alone anytime soon. When I decided to go camping in the woods alone, I thought it would be a refreshing break from the routine. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, but this time I wanted to spend a couple of nights out there. Just me, my gear, and the quiet of nature. I picked a spot about an hour's drive from home, an area with trails that weren't too popular, but still had enough open space to set up camp comfortably. I'd studied the map and packed carefully: tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, water, a first aid kit, and a reliable flashlight with extra batteries. I thought I was prepared for anything. The drive out was uneventful. The last 15 minutes were on a gravel road that wound through dense forest, and I didn't pass another car the entire way. That suited me fine. I was looking forward to the solitude. When I arrived at the trailhead, I parked my car in the small gravel lot, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The trail was peaceful. Birds chirped in the trees, and the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves was calming. I'd picked a spot about 3 miles in to set up camp, near a small stream. It wasn't too far to hike with all my gear, but far enough that I wouldn't hear any road noise or encounter casual day hikers. I reached the spot around mid-afternoon and found it exactly as I'd hoped. There was a flat patch of ground perfect for my tent, a few large rocks where I could sit and cook, and the stream burbled softly nearby. I felt a little thrill of satisfaction. This was exactly what I'd been looking forward to. Setting up camp took about an hour. The tent went up easily, and I arranged my gear inside so everything was within reach. I'd brought a small camp stove, and after everything was set up, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat on one of the rocks by the stream. The sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the ground in golden light. It felt good to be out there, away from the noise and stress of everyday life. I stayed there for a while, sipping my coffee and letting my mind wander. As the sun started to dip lower in the sky, I decided to gather some firewood. I wanted to have a fire that evening, partly for warmth but mostly for the ambience. There were plenty of fallen branches and dry wood around, so it didn't take long to collect a decent pile. By the time I had the fire going, the sun was setting, and the woods were growing darker. The fire crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows on the trees around me. I ate a simple dinner of dehydrated soup and crackers, feeling content. The first night was uneventful. I slept surprisingly well, waking only once to the distant hoot of an owl. The air was cool but not cold, and my sleeping bag was warm and comfortable. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, and the woods were alive with the sound of birdsong. I made another cup of coffee, ate a granola bar for breakfast, and decided to spend the day exploring the area. I left most of my gear at the campsite, taking only a small day pack with some water, snacks, and my map. The trails around the area weren't marked, but I'd studied the map enough to feel confident I wouldn't get lost. I spent the morning wandering through the woods, following the stream and occasionally climbing small ridges to get a better view of the landscape. It was beautiful, quiet, and untouched, with no sign of other people. I saw deer in the distance and once startled a rabbit that darted away into the underbrush. By midday, I'd made my way back to the campsite, where I ate lunch and relaxed by the fire for a while. It was mid-afternoon when I noticed something odd. I'd left my campsite tidy that morning, but when I returned, it looked slightly disturbed. My pack was sitting at a different angle than I'd left it, and the firewood pile seemed smaller. At first, I thought maybe I just remembered things wrong. Maybe I hadn't stacked the firewood as neatly as I'd thought, or maybe the pack had shifted when I picked it up. But the feeling lingered, a faint unease I couldn't shake. I shrugged it off and went about my afternoon, but I kept glancing around the woods as if expecting to see someone. There was no one, of course, just trees and shadows and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I told myself I was being silly. This was exactly what I'd wanted, to be alone in nature. I should be enjoying it, not letting my imagination run wild. The second night was different. As I sat by the fire after dinner, the woods felt quieter. The usual background hum of insects and distant animal sounds seemed muted, almost as if the forest were holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things because of my earlier unease. But when I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside my tent. It was faint, a soft rustling, but it was close. My heart started pounding as I lay there, straining to hear. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate sound, like someone or something moving carefully through the underbrush. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly as I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow over the campsite. I scanned the area with the flashlight beam, my heart racing. There was nothing, no movement, no sign of anything unusual. Just the trees and the shadows and the faint glow of the embers that I told myself it was probably an animal. A raccoon, maybe, or a deer. I zipped the tent back up and lay there, my ears straining for any sound. Eventually, the rustling stopped, and I drifted back into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I found footprints around my campsite. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, barefoot, slightly larger than my own feet, and they circled the campsite in a wide arc. My stomach dropped as I stared at them, my mind racing. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just a hiker who'd gotten curious and wandered too close. Maybe they hadn't realized I was there. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The tracks were too deliberate, too methodical. Whoever it was had walked all the way around my campsite, staying just out of sight. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I packed up my gear quickly, my hands shaking as I stuffed everything into my pack. I'd planned to stay another night, but there was no way I was spending another minute out there. I wanted to get back to the trailhead and the safety of my car as fast as possible. The hike back felt longer than it had on the way in. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the trail remained empty, and I saw no one. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I threw my pack into the back seat and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods behind me. But there was nothing, just the trees and the empty gravel road. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and windows and spent the rest of the day trying to shake the lingering feeling of unease. I never found out who or what had been out there with me. Maybe it was just another camper, curious but harmless. Or maybe it was something more sinister. I'll never know. But one thing is certain. I'll never camp alone in the woods again. Camping alone in the woods always felt like a way to reconnect with myself. I had done it before and found the solitude invigorating. But this trip in early October promised to be different. The weather was cooler, and the leaves were just beginning to turn shades of gold and crimson, making it the perfect time to spend a weekend away from the noise of the city. I packed my gear meticulously, making sure I had everything: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for the cold, enough food and water, and my trusted camping knife. This time, I'd chosen a spot deep in the forest, far from any designated camping area. The drive to the trailhead took about 3 hours, and I arrived just before noon. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. I slung my backpack on, locked my car, and began the hike. The trail started easy, with well-trodden dirt paths winding through tall pines. As I ventured deeper, the path grew narrower, the trees denser, and the sounds of the forest quieter. After 2 hours, I reached a small clearing by a creek, my chosen campsite. It was perfect, secluded, with a flat area for my tent and plenty of firewood nearby. Setting up camp took me about an hour. I pitched my tent on a dry patch of ground, not too close to the creek in case of unexpected rain, and gathered stones to build a small fire pit. Once everything was ready, I sat by the water, eating a quick lunch and taking in the scenery. The creek's gentle babble was soothing, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden beams. It felt like I was the only person in the world. As the afternoon waned, I decided to explore the area. I followed the creek upstream for a while, noticing the signs of wildlife: deer tracks in the mud, the occasional squirrel darting through the underbrush, and a fallen log gnawed by beavers. I made a mental note of landmarks to avoid getting lost. After about an hour, I turned back. The sun was beginning to dip below the treetops, and I wanted to start a fire before dark. Back at camp, I gathered dry twigs and branches, arranging them in the fire pit. With a bit of effort, I managed to get a flame going, and soon a cheerful fire crackled before me. I cooked a simple dinner over the flames and sat back to enjoy the quiet. As darkness fell, the forest transformed. The rustling of leaves became more pronounced, the creek's gurgle louder, and distant sounds, branches snapping, an owl hooting, seemed to echo eerily. I told myself it was just the amplified stillness of the night, but a part of me couldn't shake a growing unease. I climbed into my tent around 9 p.m., zipping it securely. The sleeping bag was warm, and I quickly began to doze off, comforted by the faint glow of embers outside. But my sleep was restless. I woke up several times, each time with the unsettling feeling that something was nearby. Once, I thought I heard faint footsteps outside, but I convinced myself it was an animal and forced myself to fall back asleep. Around 3 a.m., I woke again, this time to a sound that made my skin crawl. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like something knocking against wood. It was coming from the direction of the creek. My heart pounded as I lay still, straining to listen. The sound continued for a few minutes before stopping abruptly. I didn't dare move. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back to sleep, though it was a light and fitful rest. When morning came, the forest seemed almost too quiet. The usual birdsong was absent, and the air felt heavy. I stepped out of the tent, scanning the area. Nothing seemed out of place, but the unease from the night lingered. I decided to stay close to camp that day, keeping myself busy gathering firewood and exploring the immediate surroundings. I found a few odd things: a tree with deep scratches running down its trunk, far too high to be made by any animal I knew, and a patch of ground near the creek that looked recently disturbed. I chalked it up to my imagination and resolved not to let fear ruin my trip. That evening, as I sat by the fire, the unease returned. The forest felt watchful, as if it were holding its breath. I decided to turn in early, hoping to get a good night's sleep. But as soon as I lay down, the noises began again. This time, it was a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. It grew closer, then stopped. I gripped my knife tightly, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes passed in silence. Then, just as I was beginning to relax, there was a loud snap, like a branch breaking underfoot, right outside my tent. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The sound was followed by silence so profound it was deafening. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but fear rooted me in place. Hours seemed to crawl by before the first light of dawn crept through the fabric of the tent. When I finally mustered the courage to step outside, the fire had burned out and everything appeared undisturbed. But the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. I decided to pack up and leave. As I dismantled the tent, I found something that made my blood run cold. A single muddy handprint on the side of the fabric. It was human, but distorted, the fingers too long and thin. I hurriedly gathered my belongings, slinging my backpack on and double-checking that my knife was within easy reach. The hike back to the car felt endless. Every sound, a snapping twig, a bird taking flight, set my nerves on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I wasn't alone. When I finally reached the trailhead, relief washed over me. My car was untouched, and the sight of it felt like salvation. I threw my gear into the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. As I started the engine and pulled away, I glanced into the rearview mirror. The trailhead was empty, but for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just at the edge of the trees, watching. By the time I looked again, it was gone. I haven't been camping since. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, now feels like a realm of hidden dangers. I still don't know who or what was out there with me, and maybe it's better that way. Some questions are best left unanswered. When I first decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the woods, I thought it would be a peaceful escape from the monotony of daily life. I had spent weeks researching locations, poring over maps, and planning every detail. The spot I chose was tucked away in a remote forest, far from any town or trailhead. It was perfect, secluded, quiet, and untouched, or so I thought. I arrived late in the morning, parking my car at the end of a dusty dirt road that seemed like it hadn't been used in years. The forest loomed ahead, dense and dark even under the midday sun. My pack was heavy, loaded with everything I might need: a tent, food, water, a first aid kit, and a few tools. I felt prepared. I felt confident. The first few hours of hiking were uneventful. The trail was faint, barely more than a deer path, but I followed it diligently, keeping an eye on my GPS and map. The trees were tall and ancient, their gnarled roots weaving through the undergrowth like veins. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the ground and the occasional rustle of leaves as a bird or squirrel darted away. It was serene, exactly what I had hoped for. By late afternoon, I reached the spot I had marked on my map, a small clearing beside a narrow stream. The water was crystal clear, and the clearing was flat, with just enough open space to set up my tent. I unpacked quickly, pitching my tent near the stream and gathering some wood for a small fire. As the sun dipped lower, the golden light filtering through the trees made the entire scene look almost magical. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, listened to the chirping of crickets, and watched the stars appear one by one. The forest was alive with sounds: the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Felt safe, comforting even. I crawled into my tent and fell asleep almost immediately, lulled by the symphony of the woods. The next day, I spent my time exploring. I followed the stream upstream for a while, finding small waterfalls and pools that looked like they belonged in a postcard. I took photos, filled my water bottle, and soaked in the tranquility. As the day wore on, I ventured further from my camp, pushing through dense undergrowth and clambering over fallen logs. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. The forest felt different here. The trees were closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out much of the light. The air was cooler, heavier. I decided to head back, retracing my steps as best as I could. But the forest has a way of playing tricks on you. Landmarks that seemed familiar now looked different. The stream I had been following was nowhere to be seen. Panic bubbled up in my chest, but I forced it down. I had my GPS and map. I would be fine, except the GPS wouldn't turn on. I checked the batteries, but they were fresh. The screen remained stubbornly blank. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to orient myself, but the dense forest made it difficult to find any recognizable features. The sun was beginning to set, and the shadows stretched long and dark across the forest floor. I walked for what felt like hours, my heart pounding harder with every step. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing closer, their branches clawing at my clothes. The sounds of the forest had changed too. The cheerful chirping of birds was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. When I finally stumbled into the clearing where I had set up camp, relief washed over me like a wave. My tent was still there, my gear untouched. I collapsed onto the ground, my legs trembling. I decided then and there that I would leave first thing in the morning. The woods were beautiful, but they were also unpredictable, and I was clearly out of my depth. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, staring at the nylon ceiling, listening to the sounds outside, or rather, the lack of sounds. The forest was unnervingly quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stilled. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, a faint crunch, a soft rustle. I told myself it was just animals, but the unease gnawed at me. Around midnight, I heard it, a distinct sound, different from the others. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and too heavy to belong to any animal I knew. They stopped just outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The footsteps resumed, circling the tent, pausing occasionally as if whoever or whatever was out there was listening. I reached for the knife I kept in my pack, my fingers trembling. The footsteps stopped again, this time at the entrance to the tent. The thin fabric felt like no protection at all. I held my breath, clutching the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I packed up as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The forest felt different in the daylight, less menacing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hike back to my car was grueling. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my ears straining for any sound. Every snap of a twig made my heart race. When I finally reached the dirt road and saw my car, I almost cried with relief. I threw my gear into the trunk and sped away, not looking back. It wasn't until I was safely home, doors locked and curtains drawn, that I allowed myself to process what had happened. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't want to know. What I do know is that the woods are not as empty as they seem. They have eyes and ears, and they don't always welcome intruders. I haven't been camping since. I hadn't been camping in years. I had forgotten what it felt like to wake up to the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. The plan was simple: hike into the woods, set up camp, and enjoy the peaceful solitude of nature. I thought it would be the perfect way to escape the stress that had been piling up in my life. Little did I know, this trip would change my entire perspective on being alone in the wild. I drove up to the trailhead on a crisp autumn morning. The air was cool and smelled like wet leaves and fresh pine. My backpack felt heavier than I expected, packed with food, a sleeping bag, a small tent, and a few other essentials for a couple of days out there. I always liked the idea of being prepared, though I was a little overzealous. It was just me, a few miles of trail, and an entire wilderness to explore. The trail was quiet when I started. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional bird call overhead. I passed by a few trees that looked ancient, their bark twisted and worn with age. The deeper I went into the woods, the more isolated it felt. I didn't mind it. In fact, it felt kind of soothing. I wasn't in any hurry. The plan was to hike a few miles in, find a spot by a stream or river to camp, and set up for the night. About 2 hours in, I found a spot that looked perfect. There was a small clearing near a babbling creek, and the sound of water running was calming. I set up my tent and made a small campfire. The flames crackled and popped, sending little sparks into the air. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and the woods grew quieter, the fading light casting long shadows through the trees. I spent the evening sitting by the fire, eating a quick meal of freeze-dried pasta and looking up at the stars. The night was still, and it felt like the woods had swallowed up all the sounds of the world outside. I had no service on my phone, no distractions, just me and the flickering fire. It was peaceful, too peaceful in hindsight. That was when the odd feeling started. At first, it was subtle, just a sense of being watched. I shook it off, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone in the woods. But the longer I sat there, the more it grew. The shadows seemed to move unnaturally, stretching and warping in the dim light. Every now and then, I thought I saw something just beyond the tree line, a dark shape slipping between the trunks, too quick to make out clearly. I kept the fire going, hoping the warmth and light would keep whatever it was at bay. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger the darker it got. I tried to convince myself it was just wildlife, deer maybe, or a raccoon or fox, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. I finished my meal quickly and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly behind me. The wind picked up a little, making the trees sway and groan. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt that sensation again. The sense that something was out there, waiting. At around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. It wasn't an animal. At least, it didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. It was a soft, rustling sound, followed by what I could only describe as a thud, like something heavy had fallen to the ground. I froze. My heart began to race. It wasn't the wind, this was different. I strained my ears, listening, but the woods had gone eerily silent again. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps moving through the dry leaves just outside my tent. I held my breath, praying that it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The sound was too deliberate. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving with intention. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I grabbed my flashlight, keeping it under the blanket so the light wouldn't shine through the tent. I didn't want to attract attention, but I had to know what was out there. Slowly, I lifted the flap of the tent just a few inches, peering out. The beam of the flashlight swept across the campsite, landing first on the empty space around the fire pit, then over the creek. But when it hit the trees at the edge of the clearing, I froze. For a split second, I thought I saw something. A figure standing still, just at the edge of the light, watching me. It was too tall, too rigid, and its silhouette didn't seem to belong. My heart pounded in my chest. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't even a human. I quickly yanked the flap of the tent closed again, my pulse racing. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever or whatever was out there was circling my camp. I had to do something, but my mind was blank. The air was thick with tension, every small sound making my heart skip a beat. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I heard the slow, steady breath of someone or something standing just beyond the fabric. For what felt like an eternity, everything was still. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was would move away. But then, a hand, no, a large, gnarled branch, slid slowly along the side of my tent. The rough texture of it scraped against the fabric, sending a chill down my spine. I had to act. I didn't know how or why, but the instinct to survive kicked in. I grabbed my knife from my bag, my hands shaking as I tightened my grip around the handle. I was about to make a move when I heard the rustling again, followed by a loud snap, like something large had just turned and bolted into the woods. For a long time, I didn't move. I just stayed there, frozen in the dark, listening. My heart was still pounding in my chest. The rustling grew distant, eventually fading completely. I didn't know if it was gone, or if it was just waiting for the right moment to come back. But either way, I wasn't going to find out. Not tonight. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I packed up my camp as quickly and quietly as I could. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. I stuffed everything into my backpack, my hands trembling as I secured the straps. The woods felt different in the light of day, calm, serene even. But that strange feeling of being watched never left. It lingered, deep in my bones, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I hiked back to the trailhead faster than I'd ever hiked before. The sun was fully up now, and the world around me seemed normal again, too normal. The rustling, the strange sounds, the feeling of being stalked, it all felt like a bad dream. But I knew it wasn't. Whatever I had encountered out there, it was real. It was something that didn't belong. When I finally reached my car, I didn't hesitate. I threw my gear into the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and drove off, not looking back. The woods, that place of so-called peace and tranquility, had shown me something I couldn't unsee. It had reminded me that even in nature's beauty, there's a darkness that sometimes lingers just beyond the trees. But at least I was out, and that's all that mattered.